Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Please may we call Mr. Wilcox?
Yep.
You could stand here, the Bible in your right hand.
Swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Wilcox.
Morning.
My name is Emma Price, and I will be asking questions on behalf of the inquiry. Could you confirm your full name, please?
Michael John Wilcox.
Thank you for coming to the inquiry to assist it in its work and for providing the witness statement you have in advance of today. You should have a copy of that statement in front of you. It is dated the 26th of October 2023. If you could turn to page 43 of that, please.
Yes.
Do you have a copy with a visible signature?
Yes, I do.
And is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
Are there any corrections which you wish to make to your statement?
Yes, there are.
Would you like to tell us what those are?
Certainly. Paragraph 3, regarding my background. My last day of service was actually the 4th of March 2011. Paragraph 78, regarding training instruction. I've had recollection of the IC codes. Question. Paragraph 81 and 151, due to late receipt of documentation, it's to do with Barkham Post Office, which I initially said was not my case, but this has now given me another thought on that. Paragraph 84, question regarding duplicated transactions.
What was the correction you wanted to make to paragraph 84?
I don't know whether it's something that's been produced to me or something that I've happened to pick up while watching the inquiry, but there is evidence that I did have some knowledge of duplicated transactions in an ARQ.
With those corrections made, are the contents of your statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
For the purposes of the transcript, the reference for the statement is WITN 050-60100. Starting, please, with an overview of your career with the Post Office. You've said in your statement that you worked for the Post Office for a total of 47.5 years.
That's correct.
Is that figure slightly lower, given your correction saying that your last day of service was sooner in time?
No, because I think in my original statement I put it was January, so we're talking about 2 months, but it was the time that I got made redundant from the Post Office and I started another job in a post office, but it's how long I was actually in between the two dates.
I see. It's the last day of service before redundancy.
I was made redundant on the 4th of March, yes.
So the time spanned from 1973 until January of last year, with a 3-year break following redundancy in 2011. Is that right?
It was only an 18-month break because the other 18 months I was still working for Martin McCall's as a relief postmaster.
And during that time, you held a range of roles, including being a counter clerk in a Crown Office branch, an auditor and an audit manager, and of most relevance to your evidence today, an investigation manager between September 1997 and January 2011. March 2011, is that right?
That's correct.
And you say in your statement at paragraph 5 that you were approached and asked to apply for the role of investigation manager. This was precipitated, you say, by a business review and reorganisation. Can you explain, please, the changes to the business which led to you being approached?
Yes, I believe it was to do with Royal Mail and the Post Office on one of their first separations that they had. And before that, there used to be a Post Office investigation department. And the Post Office investigation department actually dealt with inquiries right across the board. When there was announcing a split and they had to choose between whether they wanted to work for the post office counters as it was, or Royal Mail, most of them chose Royal Mail. Basically, I think they were paying more money, and it was probably better prospects for them. So the POID, as it was left with very few, if any, people that wanted to stay for post office counters. So there was a bit of a recruitment drive there, I think, and I was approached because of my accounting experience mainly.
At that point, did you have any prior experience in criminal investigation or criminal law?
No.
You addressed the training you underwent ahead of taking up the investigation manager role at paragraph 6 of your statement. Could we have that paragraph of the statement on screen, please? It is page 5 of WITN 050-60100. You say, I recall attending a training course prior to taking up the post, as there was a national training event taking place in Croydon. Over the course of my time in the security team, as an investigator, I attended various training courses, including refresher courses and ad hoc meetings, training events, when any new legislation was introduced, which would affect my role. Courses attended were as follows, and the first one you list is Investigation Awareness Workshop, August 1997, 2 days. Stopping there, the Investigation Awareness Training Workshop, was that the same as the event you refer to in Croydon earlier up that paragraph, or is it a different event?
No, that's right. All the earlier workshops were taking place in a place called Impact House, which was a security training centre in Croydon.
So the Investigation Awareness Workshop was the event in Croydon?
As were all of the others, basically, yes.
Just referring to the initial
Yes.
training course you did prior to taking up the post, which you say took place in Croydon, the national training event, is that the Investigation Awareness Workshop?
Yes, sorry. Yes, it is, yes.
And you say that lasted 2 days. Can you recall what was covered on your initial training?
I think it was the basics of investigation. I remember going there. I did a lot of research in advance so that when I turned up, I knew the caution, I knew the 5 points to prove for theft, I knew about false accounting. And I was the smarty pants there, really, because every time there was a question asked, I was able to sort of come back on it. But it was covering all sorts of initial introduction to it. But it did cover everything from interviewing, taking statements, putting together case papers. Yeah.
Can you recall if that initial training covered disclosure?
If it covered putting together case papers, then the disclosure forms that we had, which were the CS forms, then yes, it would do as far as... These dates and times are all taken from certificates that I found at home. So these are firm dates that I know I had training. And as far as I can recall, I think because it was a complete oversight of everything, I would have thought so.
So you think you would have been trained in the disclosure forms which you were required to produce as part of your casework?
That's correct.
You then went on a suspected offender interview workshop in March 1999, which you say was 5 days. Then a witness interview workshop in April 1999, which was 3 days, and a search awareness course in December 1999, lasting 2 days. Whilst you were on that search awareness course, was the basis for post office investigators conducting searches covered?
Yes.
What were you told about the basis for post office investigators carrying out searches?
The course was conducted at a police training centre somewhere in London, I believe, although it was led by the post office security trainers. The searches, as far as I understood, they were purely voluntary. We had no powers of search whatsoever. We needed to get authority from the suspected offender to conduct the search, and they were purely to look for any evidence that may assist in proving an offence.
You went on a prosecution process course in March 2002, lasting 2 days. Can you recall what was covered on that course?
I think that has to be the submission of the offender file, going right through to court attendance.
Was disclosure covered on that course, as far as you can recall?
I would have to say that it was, because putting together the committal bundle, those forms have to be in there. So I would have to say yes.
Can you recall being given any guidance or training on disclosure over and above how to complete the disclosure forms?
I can't specifically say that I do. However, there were many sessions within team meetings over the years where legal services would turn up and either give refresher training or anything that changed. So I honestly can't say whether there was a specific anymore about disclosure.
Can you recall what you were told, if anything, about the disclosure duties applying to disclosure officers and prosecutors?
Well, disclosure, as I understand it, was a case of just basically at the end, when I was putting together a file, every single piece of paper or every single bit of evidence I'd lay out in front of me on the desk, and it would go on one of 3 forms, I believe. It would either be evidence, it would be unused, or the third one was anything that might harm the prosecution and help the defence. And I think the only time I ever put anything on that form was once, when it was informant details. I always used to annotate that form with, there are no items considered that will help the defence or harm the prosecution.
You then went on an audit and investigator course for Horizon, and you say it was a 1-day course delivered by ICL Pathway. There's no date there for when you attended the course. Can you remember when that was?
The certificate is undated, which is why I can't, but it was at the introduction of Horizon, so it would have been 1999.
What was covered on that course?
It was basically, it wasn't how to use the system, it wasn't about transactions, it was purely for an auditor or an investigator, which would tell you how to pull off reports that would help you identify where losses might be, or to give you the end of day reports. But it wasn't about transactions at all. It was purely about how to pull off the reports that we needed, which would help us.
Were those the reports that you could print at the counter in a branch?
That's correct.
Were you told anything on that course about the potential for balancing discrepancies to arise because of bugs, errors or defects in the system?
Absolutely not.
In August 1999, you became a member of, if we can scroll down a little please, you became a member of the International Institute of Security following completion of course 137 of the International Professional Security Association. What did you cover on that course?
I honestly can't remember what that covered. It was a business initiative at the time that I was put forward for. And I know I kept having to go to Birmingham, I think, and then sit an exam at the end of it. I think it was mainly security, so physical security, as opposed to investigation.
You also gained a City and Guilds MVQ Level 4 in investigation in June 2005. What did you cover when you were studying for that qualification?
Yeah, that was my current job as an investigator. So basically, it would take a case or 2 or 3 cases that I was doing, and it would be step checked everything I did to make sure that I was carrying it out correctly.
You say you also took part in or sat in on new sub-postmaster and staff horizon training on at least 2 occasions. Can you recall that training now?
It was basically, I'm based in Plymouth, and there was a training centre in Plymouth. And if I had any spare time at any time and I knew there was a course going on, I would just see if I could sit in on it. And that did cover new postmaster training, so it would be to do with transactions.
You refer at paragraph 67 of your statement to refresher training provided during national team meetings or whenever there was a change in legislation. Who would provide that refresher training?
Yeah, that would be criminal law team, legal services.
You say in your statement that the legal services would offer advice on case presentation as well as any changes in legislation. What kind of advice did they give on case presentation?
Yeah, I think that was all tied in with like the compliance to make sure that you had everything in the file so that when they received it, they could make a fair judgment on the evidence that you provided.
You say at paragraph 7, which is on the screen here now, that you understood your role to involve investigating possible criminal offences against the business or its clients. And you say to include protecting the integrity of the business. What do you mean by the integrity of the business?
Yeah. I think from day one, it was always an understanding that the post office was a public-owned company and backed by the government, and basically it was government money that we were using, and I think it was about being seen that the post office was a company that you could trust, because I mean, back in this time when I started, there were 13,500 post offices, and they were the hub of every city, town and village. And they wanted people to feel that that was a place that they could go and they could just trust people there.
What was your role in protecting the integrity of the business?
My role was to investigate if there was any criminal offences.
You say at paragraph 8 of your statement that you recall your line manager being someone called Jeff Hall initially.
Initially, yes.
And that was when you were part of a regional team with headquarters in Bristol, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And then when the team became a national team, you recall your line managers being David Posnett,
Correct.
then Paul Whitaker, Jed Harbinson, and finally Jason Collins. Is that right?
That's correct. I think there might have been Paul Dawkins in between as well, but it was not for a very long time. I think Dave Posnett was only about for 3 or 4 months.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 9 of Mr. Wilcox's statement? It's page 6. You say here, from the time I started working in investigation, I was always a lone worker, based initially in a room in a Crown office, and then later in the security suite in the mail centre, both in Plymouth. Initially, prior to Horizon, my manager was based in Bridgewater, some 80 miles away, and my nearest colleagues were based in either Bristol or Bournemouth, some 125 miles away. Latterly, the head office and my line manager were both based in London, some 250 miles away. I did not, therefore, have the opportunity to work within a group on a day-by-day basis like some of the teams. I therefore did not, on a daily or weekly basis, associate with many of the national team. When I needed or someone else needed a second officer, then it would normally be Gary Thomas, Bournemouth, as my first port of call. Given that you were a lone worker, as you put it, Was it difficult for you to get a sense of the issues which were arising in investigations carried out by other investigators?
I think that is the aim of that sentence that I put in, yes. Yeah.
Was your setup unusual, or were there other investigators in this position as lone workers as well?
I think the South team, of which I was a part of, I think most of those people were all, there's 5 of us, I believe. I think we were all lone workers in different parts of the country, whereas the North team, some of them, no, because London was the South team. So London, I think, might have had 1 or 2, but the North team, I think some of them were working in pairs, but we were certainly single.
What processes existed for information sharing between investigators?
Do you mean official documentation?
I mean, any processes or means
Anything.
of sharing information between investigators?
There was a post office intranet site, and part of that was that there was a security section in it as well, which only the security team would access. That would normally be used for policy updates. Failing that, I suppose anything that needed to be sent out to all team members would be sent out by email.
You say at paragraph 71 of your statement that you were totally unaware of any proceedings taking place about Horizon failings, either criminal or civil. Given that there were such cases going on during your tenure as an investigator, how effective do you think the processes for sharing information between investigators were?
It's obviously not worked. From what I've learned purely from this inquiry, from 2004, I think Lee Castleton, who I had never ever heard of before until this inquiry, I cannot believe myself that I've been there for 7 years after that, and I didn't even know about that case. At no stage did anybody sit me down or call a team meeting and say, we may have a problem here, this is what's happening, and this is how we're going to handle it.
You say at paragraph 19 of your statement that the structure and role of the security team changed many times, including our job titles. What impact, if any, do you think this regular change had on the adequacy of investigations?
I don't think it had an impact on that, because when you took on parts of physical security, which dealt with robberies, burglaries, and visiting officers about security weaknesses, it just meant that was another part of your caseload. Obviously, if you weren't doing that, you'd be allocated more investigation cases. But I don't think that impacted at all on the quality of the investigation standards.
You say in your statement that all investigations would be conducted taking into consideration the rules of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, the Criminal Procedure and Investigations Act, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, the Data Protection Act, and the Human Rights Act. Where would you have found copies of those acts as an investigation manager?
I've had to refresh my memory, and I've taken those from a policy statement to say what we worked to, just so that I could remember. I remember the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. We always carried the codes of practice. We always carried that book with us because that was produced at any taped interview. The CPIA, I remember having to go to every bookshop in Plymouth to try and buy a copy because they weren't being supplied, but we would take that with us as well. And anything else basically would be on the policy document.
You identify at paragraph 7 of your statement the official policy relating to investigations. Could we have that document on screen, please? It's reference POL 3031008. This is the Royal Mail Group Limited Criminal Investigation and Prosecution Policy. This version, if we can scroll down, please, to the bottom of the page, is dated November 2010.
Mm-hmm.
An earlier version dated December 2007 was also provided to you for the purposes of preparing your statement to the inquiry. Would you agree that it is materially very similar?
From what I recall, yes, yeah.
You were an investigation manager from 1997. In terms of the official policy governing investigations before 2007, being the earlier version of this document, there was a further document sent to you by the inquiry for the purposes of preparing your statement, which is dated May 2001. And that's a document which purported to set down the procedures and standards applying to investigations. Could we have that on screen, please? The reference is POL 001 04754. This document has a heading in the top left corner, investigation policy, and then in bold and centre, rules and standards. The date at the bottom of the page, please, is May 2001. Looking, please, to page 4 of the document, section 5, document details. We see a last updated date of October 2000. The assurance details and final review sections appear to be blank. Would you agree that a version of this document appears to have been in force from October 2000 on the face of that last updated entry?
Yes, yeah.
Going back to the first page, please. Did you recognise this document when it was provided to you by the inquiry?
I can't say I recognised it, but I've no reason to doubt that I didn't receive it.
This document sets out consignia investigation standards and consignia legal standards, as well as referring to consignia employees throughout. Was this a document which applied to the work of post office investigators?
Yes, because the post office changed its name to Consignia, so it would have been post office only and not Royal Mail.
Do you think that this was the official policy governing investigations before the December 2007 document?
If that's the last one that there was, then I would imagine that's the one, yes.
Under paragraph 3.1, we see investigation standards are addressed. The high-level investigation standards are defined as follows. All security managers who are authorised to conduct investigations into crimes or suspected crimes will carry out their duties in accordance with consignia legal standards for investigation of crime and consignia rules relating to the treatment of employees and agents in accordance with mandatory instructions detailed in investigation policies. Relevant changes in the law or any significant aspect affecting the way in which investigations are conducted will be communicated to all security managers by email, and where necessary, an amendment will be made to the database. Pausing there, do you recall there being a database with policy and standards documents on it?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Were copies of relevant legislation and guidance also contained on that database? Can you remember?
It would. Well, I can't remember specifically, but if it was something that applied to everybody with regarding the policy, then there's no reason why it shouldn't have been there.
Did you ever go to the legislation itself as opposed to a policy document when you were an investigator?
I honestly couldn't say whether I did or I didn't.
Under paragraph 3.2, we have consignia legal standards. When undertaking investigations into crimes or suspected crimes, all security managers must comply with the relevant legislation so far as this relates to the investigation of crime, the interview, arrest and search of persons and process before the courts. In particular, investigators will be bound by the following legislation, and for England, we have Human Rights Act 1998 in force from 2nd of October 2000, Police and Criminal Evidence Act and Codes of Practice, RIP Act, Regulatory Investigatory Powers Act 2000, and then we see the same entries under Wales there. Then at 3.3, please, we have prosecution casework. And it says that this will be dealt with in compliance with the following instructions. And for England and Wales, there's Consignia Prosecution Guidelines, Consignia Code of Practice, Criminal Procedure and Investigations Act 1996. Under paragraph 3.4, we have this. When undertaking investigations into crimes or suspected crimes involving consignia employees and agents, all security managers must comply with consignia rules regarding the conduct of interviews in relation to an interviewee's right to have a friend present at interviews, an interviewee's right to have a friend present at searches, and then special treatment afforded consignia juveniles. Does this part on interview rights look familiar to you?
Yes.
Was it what governed your approach to interviews as an investigator, at least before the introduction of the December 2007 criminal investigation and prosecution policy?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
Were these points, so stressing an interviewee's right to have a friend present at an interview and an interviewee's right to have a friend present at searches, was that what governed your approach to interviews?
Those points would have been from day one training. They'd always offer a friend present at interview, whether it's taped interview or not a taped interview. And the same applies to searches.
There's no reference in this section to legal rights in terms of solicitor representation, is there? There's simply, this is referring to the right to have a friend present. Does that indicate that this is a post office policy on having a friend present?
Yeah, it's basically saying it's a consignia rule or a post office rule. It's not a legal right. Yeah.
Could we have on screen another document which was provided to you by the inquiry, which governs the disclosure of unused material to the defence and is also dated May 2001. The document reference is POL 001 04762. We can see from the title that this document covers the disclosure of unused material and refers in the title to the Criminal Procedures Investigations Act 1996 Codes of Practice. Did you recognise this document when it was sent to you by the inquiry?
I can't say I recognised it, but again, it seems relevant, yeah.
It seemed what?
It seems relevant, and there's no reason why I wouldn't have had access to it or saw it, yeah.
Do you think it was provided to you when you were an investigator?
It wasn't actually handed to me, but it would have been made aware that it was on the security database.
Under purpose, this document sets out the following. The aim of this policy is to ensure that security managers know and understand the investigation procedures in relation to the disclosure of unused material, as described in the Criminal Procedures and Investigations Act 1996 Codes of Practice, which must be adhered to by all consignia staff undertaking investigations. You refer in your statement to the Criminal Procedures and Investigations Act. At the time you were an investigator, were you aware of the CPIA Code of Practice?
Yeah, I specifically, as I say to you, I had to search around Plymouth to find a copy of it. So I actually remember that there was a specific training session held by criminal law team at one of our team meetings regarding that.
This document explains in the introduction that the rules relating to the disclosure of unused material to the defence are laid down in the Criminal Procedures and Investigations Act 1996. In light of the Human Rights Act 1998, the Attorney-General has issued new guidelines on the disclosure of unused material. The guidelines clarify the responsibilities of investigators, disclosure officers, prosecutors, and defence practitioners. Were you aware at the time you were an investigator of the Attorney-General's guidelines on disclosure?
I can't recall specifically about the Attorney-General rules, but if that was covered in the updated training session we had, then it would have been covered, yes.
It is not referenced in this document, but were you aware of, and did you ever refer to, the Code for Crown Prosecutors?
No.
Further down the page, the General Principles section, we see there's a section on investigators and disclosure officers. Then over the page, please, the second paragraph on this page says this: the disclosure officer is the person responsible for examining material retained during an investigation, revealing material to legal services during the investigation and any criminal proceedings resulting from it, and certifying to legal services that he has done this. Normally, the investigator and the disclosure officer will be the same person. Do you recall that being the case, that the investigator and the disclosure officer in a case were usually the same person?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
You refer in your statement at paragraph 12 to the forms which would need to be completed by the investigator, the forms CS006C, CS006D, and CS006E. You then say at paragraph 13 of the statement that the disclosure documentation bore the name of that investigator as the disclosure officer. Did you understand at the time that you were acting as the disclosure officer in the case when you were an investigator?
Yes, disclosure of the evidence that we had obtained during our investigation, yes.
At the time, did you understand that this was a distinct role over and above your role as an investigator, which imposed upon you additional and distinct duties?
I think it was a role as part of the training as to the fact of how we conducted the disclosure and filled in the disclosure forms. I think we disclosed what we had to legal services. It really depends on what you mean by further duties.
Or did you understand that you were doing more than just filling in the paperwork, that the role of a disclosure officer was a distinct one over and above your role as an investigator, which had its own duties?
It had a duty to make sure that we disclosed everything that we had. Yes.
It is not referenced in this document, but were you aware when you were an investigator that there was an obligation on a criminal investigator to pursue lines of inquiry which pointed away from, as well as towards, the guilt of the suspect?
Yes, definitely. I mean, especially if you had a case where somebody wasn't accepting responsibility, part of that investigation into proving that they did is also trying to prove that they didn't. So that, I would say, that went automatically anyway.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 33 of Mr. Wilcox's statement? It is page 14 of that statement. A little further down the page, please. At paragraph 33, you say this: throughout my time in the security team, and even before, when I was an auditor, I believe the policy and practice regarding the investigation and prosecution of Crown Office staff and the policy and practice regarding the investigation and prosecution of sub-postmasters or their staff has basically remained the same. You go on at paragraph 34 to say that there was no distinction when it came to prosecution decisions between Crown Office employees and sub-postmasters or their staff. As between these two groups, do you recall there being any difference in approach to the question of whether a criminal investigation should be commenced, specifically following the identification of a shortfall in a branch?
It would be investigated in exactly the same way, and if evidence was found, the prosecution would take place in exactly the same way.
You had experience of both Crown Office and sub-postmaster branches in various roles you held when you worked for the Post Office. Were you ever aware of a difference in the way Crown Office employees and sub-postmasters and their staff were treated by the Post Office?
Definitely not. I took part in the prosecution against one of our branch managers myself.
Could we have on screen, please, page 6 of Mr. Wilcox's statement? The top paragraph here is a continuation of paragraph 7. About 4 lines down, you say this: away from any criminal investigation, I was also required to give assistance to Crown officers and sub-postmasters regarding loss reduction and security issues. What do you mean by loss reduction in this context?
On occasions, the Post Office had tasked people with loss reduction. It was basically about how to avoid them. I'm trying to think in one of these instances, I actually made up and prepared a presentation in connection with loss reduction, and tried it out in a team meeting with members of my own team, and we sort of tweaked it, and from then I rolled it out to the whole security community, and security managers or investigators were going around to Crown offices giving these presentations. I also offered them to the NFSP and attended 2 or 3 NFSP meetings with postmasters to explain to them about controls at the office and how to reduce losses.
And what type of losses are we talking about here?
Anything really. Obviously, branch office losses are reported through the Post Office because branch office staff are employed by the Post Office. Other losses, sometimes we get a request from a postmaster to say they're having, let's just say, niggly little losses that they can't really get to the bottom of. And I would arrange, or we would arrange, to go and meet them somewhere, normally off-site, have a chat about what they think is going wrong, and suggest improvements to ways that they can just monitor what's happening in their office.
Did this part of your role involve advising individuals following the identification of unexplained shortfalls?
It would be unexplained shortfalls. I mean, the fact that it's unidentified makes it an unknown shortfall anyway. So yes, if somebody said, look, I'm losing £20 a week, £30 a week, and I can't understand it, it would just be really having a discussion with them about the procedures at the office and what they could do to tighten up on those procedures.
You address possible causes of unexplained shortfalls at paragraphs 160 to 162 of your statement. And you give examples of errors on the part of a user of the system and theft by those other than the sub-postmaster. Does your knowledge of the possible explanations you list there come from assisting officers as well as investigating them?
The reason for that paragraph was really to try and show how difficult it is for an investigator to look at unexplained losses, the number of things that can possibly happen. And all those instances I've given you are my personal experiences over the years of money that's gone missing. It's just really, it's not, if it's an unknown loss, especially if somebody isn't declaring it, if somebody's declaring unknown loss, it's hard enough to investigate anyway. If somebody is going to cover up an unknown loss for whatever reason, I would say it's impossible to actually assist them and find out where it is.
Did it ever occur to you at the time that another explanation, in addition to those you list in your statement, might be that the horizon-generated figure for what should be held by a branch was wrong?
Absolutely not.
Turning please to the process followed by investigators after the identification of a shortfall at an audit, could we have on screen please paragraph 40 of the statement, that is page 16. Here you say this: it would normally stand that if an audit shortage was reported to the investigation team, and if an investigator and a second officer were available and could reach the branch in a reasonable time, then they would go to the office while the auditors are still there, dependent on the amount of the shortage. You go on at paragraph 41, the aim of the visit would be to obtain and secure any evidence which supports or doesn't support a criminal offence at the office, if there is any. If there have been admissions of a suspected criminal offence, then it would be prudent to undertake a taped interview with the suspect and get a first account at that time. What evidence would an investigator be seeking to obtain and secure at the branch?
If there's been a reported shortage by the auditors, then it would be to try and find either evidence by way of an interview or evidence of, if you had to, bank accounts or any financial information, if that would assist the investigation.
What evidence would you be seeking to establish a loss to the post office?
In interview?
No, at the branch, when attendance was to obtain and secure evidence.
It may be that somebody's already admitted to taking the money, in which case it would be an interview. If they haven't admitted it, but they were a suspect, and it was an interview under caution, then obviously you'd be putting questions to them as for an explanation as to that loss.
What did you see as the evidence of the loss?
The evidence of the loss would have been the auditor's findings.
And we're talking here about the difference between what the printable horizon reports said should be in the branch and what the auditor actually found in the branch.
That's correct.
You say at paragraph 58 of your statement that if there had been admissions of a criminal offence, then it would be prudent to undertake a taped interview with the suspect to get a first account at the time. Where an admission had been made to an auditor before an investigator was on the scene, was it common for the auditor to ask the person who had made an admission to sign a written record of the admission?
They would ask them to sign a written record of the events of that day, and just to agree that that's what actually took place. Yeah.
In general terms, how would you deal with any such written record in a subsequent interview under caution?
I would probably, after the opening introductions and the legal rights and friend rights, I would probably just recap what I understood happened in the morning. I would normally read out the signed piece of paper as a record of what happened that day, and then I would ask the suspect to actually give me a reason for the shortage in their own words. At
paragraph 42 of your statement, you deal with interviews. You say interviews could take place normally at the office if enough privacy is attainable and the suspect did not require legal representation or a post office friend to be present. And at paragraph 43, I have on occasions, either after visiting the office or on the day, or when unable to attend an office, pre-arranged an interview with the suspect for a future date. This would be especially true if they required legal representation, and in that case, the interview could normally be undertaken at the solicitor's office. You deal with the process applying to interviews at paragraph 11 of your statement. Could we have that on screen, please? It's page 7. You say, interviewing persons accused or suspected of a criminal offence was part of my role as an investigator. Interviews were conducted in accordance with PACE 1984 Codes of Practice. Most of the taped interviews I conducted were voluntary attendees, i.e. suspects who were not under arrest, and the interview would be conducted at a mutually agreeable venue, sometimes pre-arranged. You go on to say, on occasions, if it were necessary for the police to assist in an arrest or search, then the suspect would be arrested and interviewed at a police station. If anyone being interviewed required or attended with a solicitor, then full pre-disclosure would be given before the commencement of any interview. Just pausing there, would full pre-disclosure be provided to someone before an interview if they did not wish to have a solicitor present for the interview?
Not generally, no.
Why not?
Not sure I can answer that question. I'm not really sure. You would tend not to talk to somebody beforehand without cautioning them anyway. I've never had anybody ask me for disclosure before, because normally when I invite them for an interview, I tell them what the interview is about and why they're being interviewed. So there's normally, if it was a postmaster, they would generally understand what it's all about, whereas if they had a solicitor, they may not even understand post office procedures.
You go on, we used a standard crib sheet during interviews as reminders of procedures and questions. This was so a set format could be followed for standardisation across the team of casework papers and reports, and also assisted with the correct PACE guidelines. The crib sheet would set out from memory reminders such as explaining what would happen during the interview, opening tapes in front of the interviewee and solicitor if present, introductions of persons present for the benefit of the tape, caution and checking the understanding of the caution, explanation of legal rights and the rights to a friend being present, friend not applicable at police custody suite, points to cover during interview, i.e. background, experience, training, staffing and the role at the office, conclusion of the interview and signing and sealing of the tapes, anything else which needed to be covered under the interviewing section of PACE 1984. And you then say, dependent on the outcome of the interview, reports for legal services and the discipline manager would be prepared if necessary. You deal at paragraph 97 of your statement with the role of the post office friend. Could we have that on screen, please? It is page 29 of this statement. You say part of Post Office and Royal Mail Group policies are that any person being interviewed by an investigator, on tape or informally, is entitled to have a Post Office friend present with them. The role of this Post Office friend is to sit in on the interview. They are not allowed to take part in the interview at any stage, but are allowed to take notes on the proceedings as long as they are kept confidential. The Post Office friend should be someone who works for the Post Office and someone who is not involved in the inquiry. The reason for not being allowed to say anything in the interview is because they probably wouldn't be qualified to advise and may say something which is not beneficial to the person being interviewed. This would be the role of a solicitor, and this right should be exercised if advice is required. Pausing there, and we'll come back in due course to what happened in Mrs. Rudkin's case. Was a union representative classed as a post office friend where they attended an interview with the interviewee?
Yes, definitely. Yep.
Were individuals who chose to be accompanied by union representatives told that their representative would be classed as a post office friend and therefore not allowed to take part in the interview?
Yes, because they, excuse me, they had to sign a form to say that they understood all of that. Whether it was a union representative or whether it was a counter clerk from a different town that they'd never even heard of, they were entitled to any of those people as long as they worked at the post office. But the same rules applied to them all.
We'll come on to the legal rights form in due course, but you're saying it was your understanding that that form dealt with the post office friend as well as a legal representative solicitor?
No, sorry, I didn't say that. The post office friend was they could have a friend as well as a solicitor, but you normally found if a solicitor was there, they wouldn't allow a post office friend for obvious reasons. But the friend form was purely for people who wanted a post office friend, and that could be anybody whatsoever that worked in the post office, as long as they weren't in that office, if you like.
Did you explain to them that that union representative, because they were acting as a post office friend, would not be able to take part in the interview?
The forms were signed on tape, and that was read out, and then they would sign it that they understood they couldn't take part in the interview.
Okay, we'll come on to the form. Were individuals attending interviews told that if they wished to be accompanied by someone who could take part in the interview, they would have to have a solicitor?
I don't know if it was worded that way, but I would have certainly said, do you want legal representation or a solicitor? Because if you do, I can help you find one. And if they said no, then I would explain that they're entitled to a friend, but the friend wouldn't be able to take part in the interview and wouldn't be able to give them advice.
Could we have on screen, please, WITN 018-60100? This is a statement made for the purposes of this inquiry by a former sub-postmaster called Timothy Brentnell, who was prosecuted for theft and false accounting. Mr. Brentnell recalls you attending his branch in Rock, Pembrokeshire, after an audit in 2009 found an apparent shortfall of some £16,500. Could we turn to page 2 of this document, please? Towards the bottom, in paragraph 9, Mr. Brentnell says this: by the time I was audited in 2009, I had reduced the shortfall to some £16,500 by putting my own money into the post office when the auditors came. I was very open and honest with them about what had been happening because I thought they were there to help. I quickly realised that they were not there to help me but to blame me. I recall the auditor's name being Gaynor Davies, who had another man with her, but I cannot remember his name. This was promptly followed by a visit from an investigating team. This was a man called Mike Wilcox. Another lady was with him, but I do not remember her name. Whilst at first I thought they were there to help me and correct the fault, it soon transpired that they were auditors to try and collect evidence against me. I remember Mike Wilcox telling me it was an informal chat and asked if I would need a solicitor, and he said no. Do you recall Mr. Brentnell now?
It would be fair to say that I've only seen this document at 9:30 this morning. when you said a statement from Tony Brentnell, my immediate thought was it was somebody from our post office department. So I remember the name. I don't know what for. Rock is completely out of my patch, but I'm not saying I didn't do it. So to answer your question, I remember the name. I don't remember specifically doing this case. But at no time whatsoever do I do an informal chat with a suspect. Informal chats, or if I'm out there because somebody's asking me if they're having problems with losses. No circumstances whatsoever would there be an informal chat, and I would not take a second person with me if it was.
Have you ever told a sub-postmaster that you were investigating, that they did not need a solicitor because the discussion you were having was just an informal chat?
Definitely not, never.
In the next paragraph, Mr. Brentnell says this: I remember being told that I was the only sub-postmaster having these kinds of issues. Did you ever tell a sub-postmaster with an unexplained shortfall that he or she was the only one having problems balancing?
I don't use that phrase, no.
Could we have on screen, please, WITN 016 10100? This is a witness statement made by Hasmukh Shingadia, a former sub-postmaster, for the purposes of this inquiry. Mr. Shingadia explains in his statement that he had problems balancing. Like Mr. Brentnell, he was prosecuted for theft and false accounting. He recalls being interviewed by you at paragraph 59 of his statement. Could we go to that, please? It's page 7. He says, on the 11th of May 2010, I was interviewed at Newbury Sorting Office by Michael Wilcox. The Federation representative, Nippy Singh, was there to supposedly support me. However, in the 7 hours that I was there, he did not say a word. When I challenged him about this, he said, well, it's your post office, and got in his car and drove away. The interview was a real grilling. I was asked repeatedly where the money was. I kept saying I hadn't got it. They asked for bank statements, credit card statements, and told me if I didn't cooperate, they would come and search my flat. Do you recall Mr. Shingadia now?
Again, this was given to me at 9:30 this morning. I do remember the name. More so, I remember the fact of Nippy Singh. And in fact, I believe you've got my notebook. And I recall that there's an entry in my notebook about this case. I don't know what it says. I don't know what the outcome was. But I've returned my notebook recently because I've only just found it. And I believe this case is mentioned in it.
Well, we can certainly try and locate that. In general terms, did you ever use the threat of searching someone's property to encourage them to cooperate and provide documentation?
Searches that we conduct are purely voluntary. There was no way that I would have ever said to anybody, if you don't, we're going to do a search. At the end of the day, they're told that we may need to do a search, but it's purely with their permission. And again, they're entitled to a friend present. It's, I'm afraid I don't work for the Sweeney from the 1970s TV programme. It's just a completely different way altogether.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 68 of Mr. Wilcox's statement? It's page 23. You say, with specific emphasis on obtaining evidence from third parties, There would be occasions when further investigation was required or documents required to prove or disprove a criminal offence. With legislation changing over the years, obtaining evidence from third parties also changed. Sometimes our working partners, i.e. Department for Work and Pensions and Fujitsu, would have a contract with the business for the release of any documentation. Documentation from banks used to be obtained by the person involved in the inquiry, signing a release form for the data to be released. Later, with a legislation form, DPA, RIPA or CPIA, we would also need to submit a data protection disclaimer form confirming that the information was for a genuine investigation purpose. Any changes in procedure would be notified to us either by meetings personally or notification on a policy change in the intranet. Just picking up on the third line there, where something was required to disprove a criminal offence, can you think of an example of a time where you investigated further or sought documents to disprove an offence?
I think it's just a general term, as I said before. If I'm investigating a case and somebody said they've taken some money and paid it into their bank account, we would ask for those bank accounts, and that may show the money's gone in, or it may not show the money's gone in. It's the same with ARQ data. I don't know if you want to cover that at a later stage, but with ARQ data, you can ask for ARQ data, but it's not going to prove necessarily. It depends on what the person tells you that they've done with the money, or whether they haven't done anything with the money. But ARQ data is very subjective. My personal opinion is, depending on the type of loss and what you're told, in some instances it's no good to you whatsoever. So, can I give you an example of what I'm trying to say?
Please do.
If there's an audit shortage of £10,000 and the postmaster says to you, I took that money 6 months ago and I've paid it into my bank account. You could get bank statements from him showing that £10,000 gone into his bank. You could also ask for audit data. Now, if he tells you he's been covering up that £10,000 so nobody knows about it, you'd look at that audit data and it won't show you anything. It will show you that he's been balancing all the time. So you could argue, yeah, that's what he said, he's covering it up, that's why it's not there. But the defence could argue, well, there's no loss been shown, so how can you prove there was a loss? So that's what I'm trying to say by either trying to prove the offence or not the offence. It depends on what you're told, really.
You're referring there to what you could glean from ARQ data.
Yeah.
There were, of course, other people with different skills who could look at such data and make different types of analyses, weren't there? Specifically, Fujitsu employees would be able to tell more from the data than you could as a non-technical investigator.
The ARQ data that we got was a mirror image of the transactions that were going through the office. There was no further information on there than the sub-postmaster could have got himself. The only advantage with ARQ data is it went back further in time, as opposed to it dropping off the system in the office. And it was in the form of an Excel spreadsheet. So it was great to filter and sort figures and specifically look at things. It would tell me nothing about, if what you mean, it would tell me nothing about the back office procedures and the technical aspects of the system. No.
That's your opinion on what could or couldn't be gleaned from the data. But do you understand that that would be disclosable once you'd obtained that data? And what happened to it after it was disclosed is a separate matter from what you thought as an investigator.
If I ever had ARQ data, then it would always form part of my witness statement and evidence, whether it helped me or whether it didn't, because the paragraph would probably say ARQ data shows that it could back up this person's story, but it also maybe not.
Could we have paragraph 82 of Mr. Wilcox's statement on screen, please? It's page 26. You say, I would obtain ARQ data on any investigation where unexplained losses were involved, whether there was a suspected offence or if I was trying to assist a sub-postmaster in investigating losses at their office. Is that right, that you obtained ARQ data in any investigation where there were unexplained losses or where you were just trying to assist a sub-postmaster with unexplained losses?
If it was purely unexplained losses, then that is true. If somebody said to me, an example I used before, if somebody said to me, there's £10,000 missing, I've taken that money and I've paid it into my bank account, and I've been inflating the cash every day for 6 months to cover it up. If I could prove from bank statements that they paid the money in, ARQ data is not going to help me in one little bit. Because when I look at that ARQ data, if they're covering up the losses, it's not going to show me the losses anyway. In that instance, it's of no use for helping me. And that's what I was saying to you before about it depends what the person tells you. If it is, somebody says I'm having losses every week and it's nothing to do with me, I don't know where it's going, then yes, it would be useful to look at, but again, I'm not convinced it would actually show you anything if somebody's covering those losses up.
When you were in the role of assisting, as you put it, sub-postmasters to get to the bottom of things, and you obtained ARQ data, would you provide that data to the sub-postmaster as a matter of course?
No, I wouldn't say I would provide it to them because I was there to help them and they knew what I was doing. I might show it to them. I might have, looked at the dates of when they thought there were losses, and it might show that a member of staff was declaring cash, and it was showing a shortage in the balance, and then 2 minutes later you see the cash has been altered, and then there's suddenly a nil discrepancy. That's good evidence that somebody is changing the cash declaration, and that would be shared with the person, with the postmaster I was helping, yeah.
You say at paragraph 85 of your statement that you did not have direct contact with Fujitsu and that all requests for ARQ data went through the casework management team. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And is it also right that you recall there being a limit on the number of requests which could be made for ARQ data?
There was initially, because I remember you used to just wing off an email and just say, can you order me ARQ data for this office between these dates? And sometimes it would come back and say, well, you'd have to wait for next month's allocation. It wasn't a major problem, but it just slowed you down a bit.
Do you recall those limits ever impacting upon a decision as to whether or not to request ARQ data, either a decision that you were making or that another investigator was making?
Well, I can't speak for other investigators. As far as I'm concerned, where I thought applicable, I always ask for ARQ data, depending on the, irrespective of the limits, because if I'm going to do a job, then I need to have that information to hand. And even if it was a case where I didn't think ARQ data would help me initially, I would still ask for it, because on the off chance that I might have to do a committal bundle, and it would just save time, I'd already have it.
So I have reached the end of one topic, and the next topic is a little lengthier. Would now be a convenient moment for the morning break.
Yes, certainly. So what time shall we resume?
15 minutes. I think it's 15:15. So that would take us
11:30 then, yeah?
11:30. Thank you, sir.
Right.
Hello, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you, yeah.
we have on screen, please, paragraph 71 of Mr. Wilcox's statement? It's page 24 of the statement. You say here, this may be the time to clarify a point made about Horizon bugs, errors and defects. Up until the time I left the post office in 2011, and therefore my time in the security team, I was never given any indication of any failings within the Horizon system. Does it remain your evidence that you were never aware that bugs, errors or defects in the Horizon system could cause apparent shortfalls in a branch?
I've never heard of the phrase bugs, errors and defects until I was following this inquiry. And as I said before, that paragraph is trying to impress that nobody has specifically called the team together or me together and said about possible problems with the system. As I said to you, I can't believe I was there for years after things were happening and this wasn't communicated.
Can we have on screen, please, document reference POL 001 72808? This is an email that you have relatively recently been provided with from Mark Dinsdale, dated the 12th of March 2010, attaching something, if we can scroll down please, called a Security 4 Weekly Report. You are one of a long list of recipients of this email. What role did Mark Dinsdale hold at this time? Can you recall?
I can only go by security program manager, as it says on the bottom of the form.
And what was the Security 4 Weekly Report?
You say I've received this recently. I haven't seen this before.
Well, I understand it has been provided. If you need some time to look at this, we can take it. Perhaps if I show you the report itself, you can tell me whether you recognise that.
Yeah, certainly, yeah.
The reference is POL 001 72809. Has this document been, have you seen this recently?
This rings no bells whatsoever to me. I mean...
So I'm afraid we may need to take just 5 minutes so that I can establish what's happened in terms of the provision of this document. Certainly, Mr. Wilcox should have the opportunity to read it.
Yes, of course. Yeah, well, okay, we'll let Mr. Wilcox have the document now, and in any event, we'll take 10 minutes, and then we'll see where we go from there, all right?
Thank you, sir. Hello, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Thank you for the time, sir. The document that I took Mr. Wilcox to is one of 4 documents that I plan on going to in my questions, which were sent to Mr. Wilcox yesterday morning. Unfortunately, he hasn't had an opportunity to read those. They were on his emails, but he has now been shown those documents, and I understand has had a chance to read them.
That's correct.
Could we have back on screen, please, document reference POL 001 72808? This is the email that we started to look at before the break. Mark Dinsdale, dated the 12th of March 2010, to a long list of recipients, including you. And just scrolling down, please. This is attaching something called the Security 4 Weekly Report. My question to you before was, what was the Security 4 Weekly Report?
I'm afraid I haven't got a clue. I mean, I'm assuming it's a report that was sent, well, this looks like to the whole security team, so it's just a blanket email that's been sent to the whole security team. According to this, I mean, it's sent out every 4 weeks, but I can't recall this document at all, I'm afraid.
So you don't recall receiving 4 weekly reports?
My name's on it, so I would have received it. If you said to me it was a one-off, I'd probably say, well, that's the reason. But, I mean, if this came out every 4 weeks, I'm not saying I didn't get it. What I'm saying is I can't remember getting it.
Could we have on screen, please, the report itself, which is POL 001 72809. And this is dated the 12th of March 2010. Again, looking at this and having had a chance to read it, do you recognise this format at all? Going, please.
Sorry, no, sorry. I was thinking in a. But no, I don't recognise the format, but I'm not disputing that I received it.
Going, please, to page 3 of this report. There's a heading here, Security Programmes for Products. And under the 5th bullet point here, there is a reference to Horizon Online, and it says this: due to live service issues, the decision has been made not to migrate any further branches until these issues are fully understood, necessary actions agreed, and success criteria met. In effect, the pilot stabilisation period has been brought forward in order to assure the quality before proceeding. This will allow Fujitsu some time to resolve issues, including a higher than expected number of screen freezes and resultant recovery transactions. Do you recall being updated, whether by these kind of reports or otherwise, about issues to do with the Horizon system?
I would have liked to have had this earlier so that I could change my statement I made about knowing about Horizon. Having said that, to answer your question, no, I don't. But to take it a step further, if I was reading this back in 2008, now there is nothing in there that says it's a chance that it would cause losses. So if I did read it, it would be a case of, okay, they Horizon or Fujitsu have found that there's some sort of glitch. But it's not saying anything about this may well affect losses.
Well, you've anticipated my question of whether this would have caused you any concern if you had read it at the time.
No, and I think when you talk to me a bit further on, I think the same is going to apply. But obviously, I need to clarify to you my reason for this thinking. And in that, it's the fact it doesn't mention anything about losses. There are bound to be glitches in the system, and I would expect Fujitsu to tell us every time there is one so that we can actually act on that.
So are you saying in relation to your statement at paragraph 71, where you say you were never given any indication of any failings within the Horizon system, you want to modify that?
I stand by that paragraph in the fact that nobody called a special meeting or sat me down or called a team meeting and said, look, this is getting serious. We're getting all these complaints, or we know there's a problem and this is what we need to do. There are things like this, and as I said to you, I spotted one, I think, during somebody else's evidence, that if I'd have seen it, then it would have allowed me to alter my statement, and I would have clarified that I've never been told anything in the fact that, yes, but it doesn't mention anything about losses.
So you want to modify it in the sense that You weren't aware of failings that caused accounting discrepancies or balancing issues?
At the
that
moment,
right?
yes.
Could we have paragraph 85 of Mr. Wilcox's statement on screen, please? That's page 27 of the statement. And the last sentence in paragraph 85 says this: I have received witness statements from staff at Fujitsu regarding the integrity of Horizon, and I think whether there were any faults with a specific office to be included in that statement. What did you understand to be the purpose of obtaining such statements if, as you say you understood the position to be, there were no faults with the system?
Witness statements from Fujitsu were requested for a committal bundle. They weren't requested just for a normal investigation. And I just assumed it was something that the business set up with a contract with Fujitsu. Probably we were told, is it a section 69 statement? Is it something was about the integrity of a computer system? Have I got the right one?
Well, I can't.
Sorry,
help
all
you
right.
with that.
Well, whatever it was, there's a special section that you have to say that the computer system is working correctly. And as far as I recall, I mean, we were just from day one. I think that was the request that had to be part of a committal bundle.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 149 of Mr. Wilcox's statement? That's page 39. You say here, at no time from the installation of the Horizon system to the time I left in 2011 was I aware or made aware of any challenges regarding the integrity of the system. I neither heard nor saw any official documentation or correspondence regarding such claims. You've already made a correction to an earlier paragraph in your statement relating to challenges. In terms of this paragraph here, has your evidence changed in terms of your awareness of any challenges regarding the integrity of the system?
I think I changed paragraph 151, which basically is linked to 149, which would be to do with Barkham. And as I said to you previously, I mean, even from Lee Castleton, I haven't even heard of that one. So, no, I was unaware of. There was nobody had officially told me that we've got a problem going on.
You say at paragraph 150, in the context of your awareness of challenges to integrity, that you tried to recall your caseload over the period and did not consider you had any cases issued to you where the integrity of the system was brought into doubt. You then say you do recall being asked to sit in on an informal interview where a sub-postmistress was experiencing losses after her post office had been moved into a porter cabin. You've had the chance to go through those Barkham Post Office branch documents now. Do you think that the Barkham case is the one that you're recollecting here because of the reference to porter cabin?
Most definitely, yes.
Could we have on screen, please, POL 001-65852? This is one of the documents which you've only just had an opportunity to look at, but it essentially draws together your comments on a case where you've had emails in the past relating to this case. It is a case closure report in the Barkham case, and it was authored by you and sent on the 23rd of February 2011. The branch is identified 3 entries down on that first page. The inquiry type is cash loss. Just scrolling down a bit, please. The main inquiry type is disputed transactions. And going, please, to the bottom of page 2 of this document. Are there outstanding issues of a significant nature? And you say this case was raised following an ongoing dispute between Mrs. Stubbs and Post Office Limited regarding an outstanding debt of £28,829.05. Mrs. Stubbs is suggesting that Horizon is at fault when it was moved into a porter cabin during renovations. You go on. Along with Graham Brander, I met with Mrs. Stubbs on the 17th of January, and she was convinced that Horizon was at fault. She has retained daily transaction logs for December to January, in which time she lost £9,000, and is not prepared to release this until she can compare it to Fujitsu data. I have examined the Fujitsu data and cannot see any indications of fraud. She has declared all of the losses and has been asking for assistance for some time. There is a possibility, although she will not accept it, that an assistant has been taking the money, but that puts the onus back on her to report it to the police. I have sent her the Fujitsu data to reconcile with her daily transaction logs, but from a criminal fraud point of view, there is no scope for further investigation into criminal activity. So this is a case where you were saying at the point of case closure that Mrs. Stubbs was convinced that Horizon was at fault for the apparent shortfall.
That's what she was saying, yeah.
Could we have on screen, please, POL 404708? Page 2 of this document, please. This is an email chain about the Barkham case. In the middle of the page, we have an email from Mark Dinsdale to Andy Hayward and Ian Murphy, dated the 14th of September 2010. And this email reads as follows. Ian, Andy, this is quickly turning into a bit of a problem. This is a potential fraud where losses occurred when a sub-postmaster moved into a porter cabin but ceased the moment she was suspended and somebody else run the office. She did have a clerk, so it could transpire she has nothing to do with the losses. We are talking about 28k, a potential flag case with MPs involved. The sub-postmaster is questioning the integrity of Horizon. It looks like Contracts Chesterfield dealt with this themselves, although did speak to investigations. Once I received the paperwork from Nigel, it looks like there are numerous activities that have taken place, including somebody sending in an auditor who sat with the sub-postmaster for half a day, which clearly made matters worse. I don't know why we were never approached to deal with this as a criminal investigation in the first instance. Perhaps it was felt that it wasn't at the time. The auditor supposedly witnessed all transactions for half a day and witnessed Horizon being short, thereby corroborating her account, and also now a potential witness for her, when in fact clearly he cannot have witnessed everything. And also begs the question as to why it was left high and dry at the time and credence was not checked, etc. This now leaves us in a very difficult situation, with the sub-postmaster writing letters to Dave Smith, her MP, and no doubt countless other people. This is high profile. She has also joined the sub-postmaster's fight to question the integrity of Horizon. As it stands, no investigation has taken place by us. Various intervention has probably complicated this. Yet, because it is a question of Horizon integrity, we can't simply ignore it or drop it, but probably have some difficult questions ahead of us in terms of why it has taken so long for us to consider this criminal, if this is the course of action we take. So this email is referring, isn't it, in terms to the wider sub-postmaster's fight to question the integrity of Horizon. So multiple people raising this issue, a high-profile issue with MPs involved.
Correct, yes.
And the email above this is from, further up the page, please, Mark Dinsdale to Ian Murphy on the 17th of September. And it says this: Ian, sorry I run out of time to ring you and I'm off on Monday. I think in a nutshell we need to decide if one of the investigators who have the knowledge to sit in and sift through what has been provided along with the ARQ and go and see what the ex-sub-postmaster is holding. I think this is going to be a very onerous task, but I can't see how we can let this one go considering she is questioning the integrity of Horizon. How do you want me to deal with this one? Jason did offer some advice, but I think it has grown to be a more serious problem now with what has subsequently come to light, i.e. auditor corroborating the sub-postmaster's account. Could we go to page 1 of this document, please? At the bottom of the page, please, we see Ian Murphy to Mark Dinsdale, copied to Jason Collins on the 21st of September 2010. There are further emails above this. And then at the top of the page, we have an email from to Mark Dinsdale, Nigel Allen, copied to you from Jason Collins, and it is dated the 8th of October 2010. And it says this: Mark, Nigel, I've passed on the details to Mike Wilcox, who will review the information over the course of the next week or so, in line with his own operational workloads. I've asked that he report back his findings in regards to the matter, and we can then make an informed decision on any potential grounds for an investigation case. So the email chain below, with the emails we've just looked at, was being sent to you, wasn't it?
Yes.
Including the emails making clear that this was one of a number of challenges to the integrity of the Horizon system. No, the chain hasn't been sent to me by the looks of it. All I've got is the email from Jason Collins that went to Mark Dinsdale and Nigel Allen. The rest of the things are no. Well, we have here a top email with emails underneath which appear to be part of a chain, don't they?
Oh, sorry, I didn't read it that way when I received this. I thought they were just emails that you just put together. If you're telling me it's a faux chain, then I can't argue with you, but I didn't read this as being the previous information that I had from it.
Well, just scrolling down the document, we have a number of emails, one on top of the other.
Right, they all say forward. Sorry, can we go back to the top one again then? Okay, I accept that. It says forward. Yes, correct. Yep.
Okay. So one of the emails being forwarded to you was the one making clear that this was one of a number of challenges to the integrity of the Horizon system, and that there was an auditor who had corroborated the sub-postmistress's account.
That's correct.
On any view, you were aware when you picked up this case, weren't you, that this was a challenge to the integrity of the Horizon system and that there were others?
Yes, that would be true, yeah.
So why did you say in your statement that you were not aware of any challenges regarding the integrity of the Horizon system?
I hadn't received this information at the time, which is why I said I'd like to make an adjustment to it, as far as this email chain is concerned. I mean, I was asked to look at the case at Barkham to see whether there was any evidence of a criminal offence. I've taken Mrs. Stubbs' side and said there is no evidence of whether or not there were challenges to the system, which is what you're saying now. This case was about me seeing if there was any. My case closure is a month before I left in February. I'm not saying that I didn't do my job to the end, but what I'm saying, this was probably the last job that I ever took on. So anything after that, I think I've said to you in my statement, in 2017, I worked in the sub-office and I personally experienced a £1,000 loss. I put that money in out of my pocket. I didn't challenge Horizon. I still believed in it. Irrespective of whether people were challenging it, I still believed there was nothing wrong with Horizon.
There is one last document relating to this case, which I'd like to take you to, please, Mr. Wilcox. The document references POL 001-06847. Going to page 3 of this document, please. And starting about halfway down. This is an email from you to Lynn Norbury, Nigel Allen and Mandy Talbot, dated the 18th of January 2011. Do you remember Mandy Talbot?
I think she was civil litigation, possibly in legal services. Not sure I ever met her. I didn't get involved in civil litigation.
Do you know why she was involved in correspondence about the Barkham Post Office, which is the subject of this email?
I'm only assuming that if there was no criminal offence, I mean, the investigation team drop out and it's dealt with by civil litigation for recovery under the terms of the contract.
You say this in your email. I met with Mrs. Stubbs yesterday and discussed the outstanding debt with her. This was not a suspect interview, under caution. The £7,000 REM shortage on the 25th of May 2010, she was aware of, as this was due to the REM being opened and checked by the auditor on the day. Due to a rush dispatch, £7,000 was left out of the REM. Was resealed. She says that this was sorted out by the auditor on the day and she wasn't aware that she still owed the £.
That is a 7. It's the ampersand above the 7.
The £7,000.
Yeah.
I will need to trace the auditor and discuss how this amount was disposed of or accounted for. She is more annoyed at the fact that she thinks she did not get the support from Horizon regarding checking her figures against the system. The main point is for the December trading statement, when she only opened for about 2 weeks and still lost £9,000. Over the page, please. I have agreed to obtain the full data from Horizon and look at the transactions for that period. I think this may help to convince her that Horizon is okay, and it may be that someone has taken the money. It doesn't help that someone in her village used to help in designing Horizon and has suggested that Horizon is not perfect. She knows she owes for the office removal £3,400, I think, and says she will repay when the office is sold. We'll update you later. Was this not a case where somebody whom you interviewed explicitly raised the unreliability of Horizon as a reason for the shortfall?
Yeah, definitely.
Why were you trying to convince Mrs. Stubbs that Horizon is okay?
Because I was never told anything different to that.
Was it suggested to you by anyone from the post office that you should convince Mrs. Stubbs that Horizon is okay?
Absolutely not. I mean, that's probably my terminology in the fact that I truly believed in Horizon. I mean, I think initially in my witness statement, I said to you this wasn't my case. I've gone from being not my case to actually doing quite a bit of work on it and not proving any criminal activity. And I now do recall that she did have a gentleman with her. I believe he was a professor in computers or something. I don't recall the bit about he helped design Horizon. And to be honest, he just completely baffled me because it was technicalities. And that's really what I've reported back. I've said it's not, no evidence for a criminal offence. I go back to my thing I said this morning. Just because Horizon showed no criminal offence, it doesn't mean to say that somebody wasn't taking money and covering it up. But ARQ data would not show you that. So I have to stand by the fact there was no evidence for a criminal offence, and I've referred it back and closed the case as far as the criminal aspect is concerned.
Could we have back on screen, please, the case closure report, which is POL 001-65852? Back to page 3, please. You say here that you examined the Fujitsu data and could not see any indications of fraud, which is what you've just referenced. Is that what you were looking for, indicators that Mrs. Stubbs had committed fraud when you were looking at the data?
Not the fact that Mrs. Stubbs was collecting fraud, no, just anything at all. I was looking for cash which had been redeclared. I was looking for alterations to anything. As I say, it is an exact copy of what Mrs. Stubbs would have had at the office. She could have looked at it on a daily basis, but after, I think, 6 weeks, it drops off the system. So I could have gone back as far as I wanted to. But I think, as I said before, the fact that there are losses shown, it doesn't tell you whether it's a genuine loss or whether it's a loss because somebody's taken the money, or whether it's a loss because the money's fallen in a waste paper bin or it's fallen down behind a shelf. It doesn't tell you any of that. But it also doesn't tell you if somebody's covered it up. So even on a cash declaration, if there was a £1,000 shortage and then 2 minutes later it's been altered, it may be that they've genuinely found that when they're recounting their cash. It may be that they've covered it up because they've stolen the money. That's why I don't totally rely on the ARQ data unless it proves what the person's telling you.
Did you look at this data with a view to trying to get to the bottom of the shortfalls, or was it simply to establish whether or not there was a criminal case to be pursued?
ARQ data would not have helped me get to the bottom of the shortfalls. If I was looking at a shortage of £200 from 6 months ago, where do you start? The whole thing about if you have a loss of £200, you report it on the day and ask for help. Whether the post office gives you help, I'm afraid I can't comment on that. But if somebody comes to me and says I've lost £200 6 months ago, I've got absolutely no chance whatsoever of finding out where that £200's gone.
Once it has been decided that there will not be any criminal action taken against a sub-postmaster, would there be any effort made to get to the bottom of shortfalls by the post office?
I mean, I can't comment. I'm assuming once my case is closed, it would go back to the customer services or the help desk or whatever, and they should continue to look at it. If they don't, then that's pretty bad.
Were you ever made aware of an issue which was termed the receipts and payments mismatch issue?
I don't recall that, no.
Were you aware that there was a bug which could impact upon balancing in a branch?
I wasn't, no.
Were you aware that it was possible for Fujitsu to alter a branch value at the counter of a branch without the branch knowing?
I did not until I watched Richard Rowe's evidence 2 months ago, and that is the only true thing that's actually convinced me that there was something wrong. Before that, no idea. Nobody told us. I thought it was a secure system, and common sense tells you if somebody's going to go in and alter a computer system, it's got to be controlled by a secondary management or something, but nobody should be able to get in and have access.
You have made a correction this morning to paragraph 84 of your statement relating to the duplication of transactions in ARQ data. Could we have on screen, please, POL 001 67367? And this is one of the documents which you've only very recently had a chance to look at.
That's correct.
I'm aware of that. This is an email from Jane Owen to a list of recipients, including you. It is blind copied to Penny Thomas. It is dated the 29th of July 2010. And the subject line is Fujitsu duplication of transaction records. Does this email assist you with recalling the duplication of transaction records issue?
Right. Without seeing it, I'd have said no. Having seen it, the only thing that rings a bell with me is seeing this tab 1, tab 2 and tab 3. And if I had to really think back, I've got a feeling that whilst I'm copied in, it didn't affect me. I didn't have any outstanding ARQs. but I read this as affecting the ARQs only.
Just looking at the text of the email, it says, as you are aware, due to recent problems with Fujitsu, all ARQ requests have been suspended. I can now advise that the enhancement due to delete duplicated records from the returns has been developed and is due to be tested by Fujitsu at the weekend. The attached spreadsheet highlights all requests as follows, and tab 1 is duplicate entries. Fujitsu have supplied this list of requests that have been dispatched to you but contain the duplicate data. And then there are 2 other tabs. It says underneath there, I realise that you all have deadlines, but we now need to be realistic in how we expect Fujitsu to deal with the outstanding requests. Can I ask that you all please look at your cases and advise the actual dates that you require the information by? Court cases and committals will need to take priority, especially those on the first tab, as the incorrect data could already have been submitted. If entries were being duplicated, that would affect the integrity of the audit data, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would, yeah.
This was, on the face of things, an issue meaning that unreliable Horizon data had been produced in support of shortfalls which were being prosecuted, wasn't it?
I mean, Fujitsu have pointed this out to us, which I would have expected them to do anyway. It does say they have supplied some lists already, but as I said to you, it depends in which context they're being used. But if they're being used in the context that they're being used to support a shortage, to be honest, I don't really know. I don't know in what context they would have been used.
Did this issue cause you any concern at all at the time?
No, as I say, I mean, I think I put in the statement as well that whenever I got ARQ data, I always sorted it anyway into either, first thing I would do is check to see the users in the office. So that would show me that anybody that's used the computer are properly meant to be at the office anyway. And then if I'm looking for, say I'm looking for a £900 shortage, I would sort it so that I've got all the £1,000 deposits, because that might show that it's been a keying entry. Somebody wanted to deposit £100, the clerk's put an extra note on, that gives you a £900 shortage. Doesn't mean to say that it would prove it, and back to my same argument, but it's a chance that that may have happened. So I think I would have noticed, and I say I don't think I had any involved in this, but I would have noticed if there were duplicate entries because they would have been sorted in order.
I would like to turn, please, to your involvement in the criminal investigation and prosecution of Susan Rudkin. You first became involved in the investigation on the 20th of August 2008, is that right? Do you feel free to refer to your statement?
Yeah, I'll take that, yes, thank you.
You and your colleague Gary Thomas were on another inquiry in the Worcester area, and you received a call asking you to attend the Ibstock branch.
That's correct.
Can you recall who it was who called you to ask you to attend?
I can only assume it would be my line manager, because nobody else would have any reason to tell me to, really.
Can you recall what they told you about the case?
That there was an audit shortage, and we needed to, I think there was an audit shortage and we needed to attend to make some inquiries.
The person who called you, you say in your statement, told you about a conversation which had already taken place between Colin Price and Mr. Rudkin, the sub-postmaster of Ibstock branch. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
What were you told about this conversation?
I was told that they'd had a conversation, and can I please? Yeah, sorry.
So you start dealing with the case at paragraph 91. And at 93, you refer to Colin Price. If we can have that on screen, please. It's WITN 050681000. It's paragraph 93 on page 29. And you say here, I was informed, and this is in the context of you being telephoned to go out to the branch, that Michael Rudkin, the sub-postmaster, had spoken to my colleague Colin Price, who knew Mr. Rudkin. And then you say this at 94, I contacted Colin Price and was told that Mr. Rudkin had said he would allow an interview to take place on his premises and said that his wife would cooperate fully with any investigation and would not require a solicitor. Who was Colin Price?
Colin Price was an investigation manager in our team.
And what were you told about the conversation that Colin Price had had with Mr. Rudkin? Was it just this, what he'd said about allowing an interview to take place on his premises and that his wife would cooperate fully and would not require a solicitor?
Yeah, I think the reasoning behind that is the system changed over the years with regard to the number of people that were required to do an audit, an investigation. Just after I joined the investigation team, one of our colleagues in Royal Mail, during a search of a premises, got stabbed and fatally wounded. And the business changed its risk assessment policy and said that if you were going to go to a premises and you were going to do a search, there had to be 3 people with you so that one could always stay with the suspect and you'd have warning signs if you had to leave the premises quickly. So part of that conversation in the back of my mind would have been about, do I do a risk assessment on whether we go or not? And the fact that Colin knew Mr. Rudkin, it was a case of decided I didn't need a third person. It wasn't like we were possibly going to, it's not like you're looking for stolen pension books or stolen mail stacks or stolen. At the end of the day, it was going to be a normal investigation. So I was quite happy. Without other times, we phoned the police and we asked if there's any markers on the premises that were going in. And I decided not to do a risk assessment on that. So that's really why those questions, or that's the conversation we had about it.
So that was because Colin Price knew Mr. Rudkin?
I'm assuming, yeah, I mean, Leicester area is way out of my patch. I mean, I don't think I have been to Manchester before, but I've never been to Leicester. I'm not sure.
But in terms of the relevance of this to you not doing a risk assessment, are you saying you didn't do a risk assessment because you didn't think Mr. Rudkin was a threat because he knew Colin Price?
I think so. Colin must have been his area that he covered, and Mr. Rudkin must have known Colin, yes.
So looking at paragraph 94, you'd been told that Mr. Rudkin would allow an interview to take place on his premises, his wife would cooperate fully, and any investigation would not require a solicitor. So when you went to the branch, was that your expectation that Mrs. Rudkin would be interviewed there without a solicitor?
That's what I've been told, but obviously I would have checked that when I arrived.
Could we have on screen, please, your report for legal services completed in this case? The reference is POL 000-46485. We can see Susan Rudkin's name at the top. Going to page 3, please, of this document. We can see towards the bottom your name and date of the report. A little further down, please. The 2nd of September 2008. Going back a page, please. And towards the top of the page, in the second paragraph, you deal with what happened when you attended the branch. You say, when we arrived at the office, we introduced ourselves to Mr. Rudkin and then went into the post office secure area where Paul Field was compiling the audit. He handed me a signed admission statement by Mrs. Rudkin and informed me that at the time the discrepancy in the account was £43,856.89, which was mainly due to a shortage in the cash of £43,761.17. You describe here a signed admission statement made by Mrs. Rudkin. Can we have on screen, please, the document to which you're referring? The reference is POL 000 45243. Is it possible to zoom out a little? So just looking at this document, the first thing to note here is that it is not, in fact, a statement made by Mrs. Rudkin, is it? It's authored by and from the perspective of the auditor.
Yeah, I think I said it's a signed statement. I didn't say it was a signed admission statement. It's a signed statement of facts of what happened on the day.
Well, we've just looked at it, but we can look at it
Yeah.
again. Going back, please. POL 000 46485. Second page, please. Second paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
He handed me a signed admission statement by Mrs. Rudkin.
Apologies, I'm reading the next one down, which just says a signed state. It is an admission. It's an admission that there's going to be money missing at that stage.
If you can just hold on there.
Sorry.
And wait for my questions. If we can go back, please, to the note itself. It's POL 000 45243. So this is not, in fact, a statement made by Mrs. Rudkin. It's authored by and from the perspective of the auditor, isn't it? Starts, myself and Kevin Watkins arrived at the office.
Correct, yes.
And the auditor wrote as follows: myself and Kevin Watkins arrived at the office at 8:20 a.m. following the necessary checks with the helpline. And that word seems difficult to read, but Sue Rudkin, wife of sub-postmaster, allowed us access to the secure area. Mrs. Rudkin asked me if she could have a word in the back office. When I entered, she told me that the safe would be a little short of money. When asked how much, she stated approximately 40,000. She also stated that the sub-postmaster, Mr. Michael Rudkin, did not know anything about the shortage. And then there's a line underneath: this is a true and accurate reflection of what was said. And it seems to be signed by both, although we can't see the signatures, Mrs. Rudkin and the auditor.
Yep.
On this account, Mrs. Rudkin had said the auditor would find a shortage. Just to be clear, because you have used the word admission to describe this document, Mrs. Rudkin, on the auditor's account, was not admitting to any offence, was she? She was informing him that there would be a shortage.
She was admitting that there would be a shortage, correct.
Could we have back on screen, please, POL 000 46485. Page 2, please. And about a third of the way down the page. In the fourth paragraph here, you say, later that day, after declining representation, GS 001 copied at Appendix B, I conducted a tape-recorded interview with Susan Rudkin in the private residence at Ibstock Post Office. Just to get the order of events clear before we look further at that paragraph, could we look 2 paragraphs down on this page, please? The penultimate paragraph, starting with following the interview. You say, following the interview, Mr. and Mrs. Rudkin consented to a search of the premises and produced current bank details and statements which have been forwarded to Jed Harbinson, financial investigator, who has an interest in this case. And then you say, we also recovered paperwork from the post office, including the record of shortages being maintained by Mrs. Rudkin. Is it right, therefore, that you did not obtain any documentation other than the signed auditor statement before interviewing Mrs. Rudkin, just to get the order of events clear?
Yeah, correct.
Could we have on screen, please, paragraph 96 of Mr. Wilcox's statement? That is page 29 of the statement. You say Mrs. Rudkin agreed at 96 to be interviewed on tape in her private residence, and she did not require any legal representation, which confirmed Mr. Rudkin's conversation with Colin Price. Could we have back on screen, please, Mr. Wilcox's report for legal services, POL 000-46485. And page 2 again, please. At the top of this page, you refer to Mr. Rudkin's conversation with Mr. Price. So this is continuing from the previous page. Interview to take place on his premises, and said that his wife would cooperate fully with any investigation, would not require a solicitor. And at the 4th paragraph on this page, you refer to conducting that interview at the private residence. You do not in this report refer to any conversation with Mrs. Rudkin about whether she would consent to be interviewed. Did you in fact ask her whether she would agree to be interviewed before sitting down to the interview?
Yeah, I would have explained that I would need to interview her regarding the alleged shortage in the accounts, yes. And she agreed, yeah.
So you didn't just take her husband's word for it?
Well, I couldn't force her to be interviewed, no. I mean, I'd just say, I need to interview you. Are you willing to do that here? I can do that in your premises if you're happy with that. I'd probably said to her at the time, are you likely to want a solicitor? And she said no, which would have been confirmed on tape with the signing of the GS001.
Could we have on screen, please, page 30 of Mr. Wilcox's statement? At the top of this page, which is a continuation of paragraph 97 of your statement, you deal with the question of representation at interview. And you say, oh, apologies, I'm ahead of the monitor. So at the top of the page, this is a continuation of paragraph 97, and you're dealing here with the question of representation at interview in Mrs. Rudkin's case. You say, I seem to recall that Mr. Rudkin had made some phone calls to colleagues with a view to acting as a friend for his wife, but no one was available. As it was her wish to have a friend present, I took the unusual approach of allowing her son Dale to sit in if she was agreeable. Unusual because Dale did not work for the post office, so although I broke the post office friend rule, it was not a legal entitlement. I could, of course, have suggested the interview was conducted at the police station, where the post office friend rule was not applicable, but I considered that to be unnecessary and over the top, as Mrs. Rudkin was agreeable and compliant. So you recall Mrs. Rudkin wanting to have someone present in interview with her, is that right?
I would say, yes, it must have been, but probably her husband had said to her, you need to have somebody with you as well. I can't guarantee that, but that's from my reckoning. He was sort of trying to look after her the best he could, I think.
And Mr. Rudkin tried to find someone from the post office to attend, but nobody was available. Why didn't you put off interviewing Mrs. Rudkin until someone could be found?
I think there was a large shortage. There was an admission that the money was missing. She was the suspect, and I had a job to do, and it seemed right to continue the interview there. I wasn't stopping her from having anything. If she wanted a solicitor, on the other hand, and we couldn't get one, then I might have had no option but to suspend it.
You took the unusual step of letting Mrs. Rudkin's son sit in the interview with her, and you suggest here that the alternative was to suggest the interview was conducted at a police station. Did you suggest that alternative to Mrs. Rudkin?
Absolutely not. I'm trying to explain to the inquiry why I made that decision.
Could we have on screen, please, POL 000-46546? This is the legal rights document, the GS001 form that you completed with Mrs. Rudkin at the start of her interview. So we see the date there, the 20th of August 2008. And scrolling down, please. You can see the name printed at the bottom and signed. Looking at that form, this deals solely with the question of legal representation, doesn't it?
Yes, it
because
does.
it is a legal rights form. So it doesn't deal with the post office policy on someone being accompanied by a post office friend, does it?
Not this form doesn't, no.
Which form does? Because you referred earlier to a form that did refer to a post office.
Yeah, it's the same layout as this. I don't know this is a GS001. What's this?
GS001.
One.
Yes.
I think it's maybe a 003. It's the same format. It's got the same. Do you understand you're acting as a friend? Yes. Do you understand you're not allowed to take part in the interview? Yes. You may keep notes, but they may not be shown to anybody without the permission of the post office. Yes, 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 and then they sign that. So that is also part of that would have been in the same appendix as this form was in my case file.
Could we have on screen, please, the record of tape-recorded interview with Mrs. Rudkin? The reference is POL 000-50026. We can see the date of interview, 20th of August 2008. The time is 1 p.m, the duration 44 minutes, and the location private residence, Ibstock branch. Scrolling down a little, please. There is a summary of what you covered at the outset of the interview, normal introductions including voice identification, legal rights and caution, no legal representation required, Sundale allowed to sit in as friend. You described the step of letting Mrs. Rudkin's son sit in on the interview with her as unusual. Did you allow Mrs. Rudkin's son to sit in because Mrs. Rudkin appeared to need emotional support? Was that the reason?
No, I think it was more a case of because he was there and he was a family member, she would have felt that she wasn't alone. I was just trying to help out the fact that they were trying to get a friend, and I did my bit the best I could to get that dealt with and not let it go on for however long until we could agree that she could find somebody. I think I've put emotional support in my statement, which is probably the best. What I'm saying is it just felt like she had somebody with her.
Did you ask yourself at the outset of the interview whether Mrs. Rudkin was in a fit state to be interviewed emotionally?
I had no reason to doubt that she wasn't.
Could we go to page 2 of this document, please? Scrolling down, please, to 918 on the left. At 918, you show Mrs. Rudkin the auditor's statement, and you ask her why it is short, so why the branch is short. Over the page, please. Four lines down, you ask where the money has gone. And Mrs. Rudkin says this: well, because the business as a whole and the staff, the overheads in the business have not been really doing what it should be doing. I've had, losses behind the post office counter, and then coupled with trying to sort out the business and difficulties, I've just not know which way to turn. And then you say this: MW clarifies that there have been losses in the post office, and under the terms of the contract that should be made good. You ask, is part if this, because you haven't been putting the money in to make the losses up? Mrs. Rudkin says yes. You asks if trading statement is short, would you just inflate the cash to make that right? Yes. Also had bills for shop and house, gas and electric. Mrs. Rudkin agrees. Going over the page, please, to page 4, towards the bottom at 1927. And we see GT here. That's not you, is it? That's Gary Thomas.
Gary Thomas, correct.
Trying to understand how the amount got so high. Mrs. Rudkin says that it started with the shortages and not being able to make them good. And when she did pay some back, she would be short for bills, and then taking money in the hope of paying back from takings. And then over the page, please, towards the bottom of the page. If we can have page 7, please. And again, towards the bottom of the page. Apologies, back to page 6, towards the bottom. And MW at the bottom here clarifies the other option could have been a balance snapshot to tell you how much it was out. And this is in the context, isn't it, of Mrs. Rudkin having kept a running total, so she knew how much things were out by.
Correct.
And going over to the top of the next page, please. Mrs. Rudkin says, as time has gone on, I've had to do a balance snapshot and check the figure, and then write that figure down so I know what to put in. You explain that any difference between the balance snapshot and her piece of paper would be a genuine shortage, which would have been added onto the paper. She says yes. Gary Thomas clarifies that any difference between the snapshot and paper record must be added on the running total as well. MW asks if she ever made any shortages good. She says, yes, I tried the best way I could. MW, what, the smaller amounts? Mrs. Rudkin, yes. Confirms larger amounts would be added on to the piece of paper. Discussion whether anyone else could have taken any money. And SR says she believes it is just mistakes. Staff are good with the paperwork. Mrs. Rudkin was, in this interview, telling her that her problems had started because she was experiencing shortages, wasn't she?
Correct.
That she made these good for a time from her own money until she was no longer able to do so.
Correct, yeah.
Because she had been making good the shortages, she was short on money for the bills. And at that point, she took money out for this reason, and she meant to pay it back. Is that a fair summary of what she was telling you?
I think, yes, that's probably a fair summary, yeah.
So Mrs. Rudkin may not explicitly have said that the shortages she was experiencing were caused by a fault in Horizon, but she was quite clearly telling you that her problems started with unexplained losses, wasn't she?
I think, to be fair to Mrs. Rudkin, in 2008, like me, she probably never suspected anything wrong with Horizon. So that would be the reason that she's never mentioned it, and that's trying to be fair, really. She did, but on numerous occasions she said that they were errors. A lot of them had come back. Some of them they found. But I'll carry on when we get to the next part.
Could we have back on screen, please, Mr. Wilcox's report for legal services? POL 000-46485. Page 2, please. The penultimate paragraph on this page towards the bottom, please. And the second sentence here, which we've already looked at, we also recovered paperwork from the post office, including the record of shortages being maintained by Mrs. Rudkin. So after the interview, you found a record of the shortages that Mrs. Rudkin had been experiencing, is that right?
I asked her in the interview, because she brought up the record. I asked her in the interview where it was, and she told me where it was, and she produced it to me afterwards.
You describe this further over the page in your report as a summary of the weekly balance discrepancies compiled by Mrs. Rudkin. Apart from attaching this documentation to your report for legal services, what did you do with this document produced to you by Mrs. Rudkin?
That would have been in Appendix B with the evidence.
Did you make any attempt to establish the reason for the shortages listed on that document?
Because of what she was telling me in an interview about the way that she was dealing with the losses, and this is where we come back to audit data. If somebody says to you, I've been taking money and I've been inflating the cash each week to cover it up, audit data will not show you that at all. It will not prove anything either way. We've also got the fact that she was doing a balance snapshot. Now, if I can explain, the normal way of declaring your cash at night is you count the cash you've got, you put it into the Horizon system, and the system will tell you how much you're out by discrepancy, whether you're over or you're short. That will show on audit data, that will show that you've done that. If, however, you go into the system and you ask the system how much money you should have, which is called a balance snapshot, you can then automatically add that money into the system, whether it's there or not. And that will not show a shortage. And this is what I was saying about it depends what somebody tells you about audit data. Audit data would have not helped me or Mrs. Rudkin one bit in proving it. The evidence I had was an audit shortage. I had an admission telling me that she'd been taking money and inflating cash. And I had this piece of paper from her supporting those figures. That evidence was far greater than I would have ever got from any Horizon data.
So it is 1 o'clock. May we take lunch at that point? Could I ask that we have a slightly shorter lunch, given the time we lost earlier, coming back at 10 to 2, please?
Yeah, right, yeah. See you at 10 to 2.
Thank you, sir.